Hello, and welcome to Shaking and Sipping. This is the show where we shake or stir a cocktail or other mixed drink, give it a sip, talk a bit about its history, and see how it is. We're continuing to work our way through IBA's official list of cocktails to see how each of those stacks up and if they deserve their place on that list to some extent. We're in the Unforgettable section, and this week's Unforgettable is the Porto Flip. Now this is going to be a fairly short episode because the Porto Flip is an odd drink. It's not really a flip in many ways, and it really has very little in common with other flips. Also, a flip can be an interesting beverage, but it's really more of a wintertime beverage. It is hot, so I am not going to be going through a whole bunch of flip variants today, though that may be a future episode. So what the heck is a flip? Well, a flip, historically, is mostly... Whoa, that was weird. Suddenly my cocktail-related show set seems to be covered in beer and brewery memorabilia. What was I even saying? Let me think. Oh yeah. Flips traditionally are made mostly of ale. So I guess that is fitting, and I really didn't have that much to talk about this episode, so let's talk a little bit about that. So flips go back to at least the 17th century, if not earlier, and were a concoction that was primarily ale. And we should talk a little bit about what that means in the time period. So today, when we say ale, we're contrasting that with something like a lager. We're saying this is a sort of beer which uses a top fermented yeast and is not lagered. Back in the day, that would not be the case. So by the 17th century, this is starting to change, but before that, ale and beer are two separate categories. Ale being something which is just grain yeast and water, so essentially the same as what you'd use as a base to make a whiskey, whereas beer had the addition of hops or earlier other things, gruit and other flavorings and things, both as preserving agents and as bittering or flavoring agents. So when we say ale in the context of the 17th century, it could mean sort of either thing. And as a side note, campaign for real ale, folks in Britain, I see you. We're not talking that much about beer today, but I respect your position on what ale is. Anyway, ales at the time were incredibly mild, both in alcohol concentration, because ale traditionally, and beer as well, was drank in place of water because it was safer. So people would drink gallons of the stuff a day, the sort of things we have today where many, of my favorite beers are 8% or more alcohol. You certainly can't do if that is the only thing you get to drink from morning till night, unless you don't want to be very productive. And also, as I said, ales at the time would have been either non-hopped, or ales were starting to be hopped at this time, but they'd be very lightly hopped. Think of an English mild, right, as opposed to a bitter or something that's actually bitter, like a IPA or that sort of thing. So anyway, with that out of the way, a flip was an interesting way of making an ale a bit more interesting and a bit thicker of a drink. It was a hot drink. It's a mixture of ale, eggs, some sort of spirit, typically brandy, and possibly a little bit of sugar or some other ingredients. There were some interesting ways of making it. You could heat the ale first and then mix it with everything else. You could also mix everything and then shove a hot fireplace poker into the drink and heat it that way. That also adds an interesting sort of bitter vibe to the drink, as that intense contact with the hot iron will turn some of the sugars and starches in the beer and just, burn them. So that gives an interesting take on it as well. Now, this sort of flip was very common in the 17th century, very common into the 18th century. But it starts dying out and changing. So it starts changing, a lot more cold flips start happening, and also the beer disappears, or the ale, excuse me. Instead of the ale, we begin seeing flips which are just spirits, sugar, egg, possibly some other flavorings, and those become known as flips, but they're not that popular. So In the first edition of Jerry Thomas's book, which we talk about quite often, The Bon Vivant's Companion, there are two things that are called flips. There's a sherry flip, and I think there's one other flip, I don't remember. And those are pretty simple cold flips. In one of the later versions, the 1887, which is the one that he had no part in because he was already dead, and that's the one where lots of instructions get real strange in that book, that one adds in a whole bunch more flips, including some hot flips and other things, but then they largely disappear and aren't talked about that much afterward. Now, you still see recipes for flips today, but they tend to be very different from a proper flip. So for one, a lot of flip recipes I saw in researching this that are recent call for the addition of cream or milk. Now, that's a perfectly fine thing to do in a drink, except then you're creating a nog. And so I'm sure at some point we'll talk about eggnog. A nog is essentially a flip which has cream added to it. It's not the same thing. See a lot of other sort of buttered rums and things which are referred to as flips. Those aren't really flips either. A flip should really be spirit, maybe beer, maybe water, egg, sugar. And that's what we're kind of looking for here. Well, that's weird. All of the beer paraphernalia seems to have disappeared. All right, well, I guess we can talk more about this specific drink then. So this drink, the Porto Flip, oddly does appear in one of the versions of Jerry Thomas's guide that he was actually alive to edit. Except it's not called a flip. It is called a coffee cocktail, despite it having no relationship to coffee and not really being a cocktail because there's no bitters therein. But apparently it's named that for the look of the drink, which, okay, whatever. It's very simple. It is going to be brandy, egg, no sugar, and then port wine. So that's why I say this really has very little to do with earlier flips. It's not hop, there's no ale, there's no sugar, there's no flip methodology. So the name flip comes from flipping the drink between pitchers to help blend everything together. We don't do any of that here. So I guess this is adjacent to a flip, but it ain't that flippy. All right, so we're gonna start off with our port. I'm using a 10-year-old tawny port. There are some sources that call for a ruby here, so a much sort of less aged product. IBA calls for tawny, and I think it actually makes more sense here, so we're gonna stick with that. I want 1.5 ounces, or about 45 milliliters of my tawny port. And then we need brandy, and of course, as usual, when we're asked for brandy in one of these older style recipes, what we want is a cognac, specifically a nice blending cognac like the Pierrefonds 1840. And of this, we're gonna want 1/2 ounce. That's 15 milliliters, give or take. And then egg. So flips, almost always, with one exception that we're going to talk about next week in a sort of related drink, call for a whole egg. IBA calls for 10 milliliters of egg yolk, which is weird. I'm assuming they're doing this because in many bars, of course, you keep a bottle of egg white, so that's ready to add to things. I don't think most bars make enough flips to keep a bottle of egg yolks around, but maybe they do. I'm not going to be doing that though. I'm just going to put in an egg yolk. I will go ahead and follow their lead and not use the whole egg, but I'm not going to measure out yolk. Ooh, boy, that was a poor shell action for me. So we're going to do a finger strain. I generally do the back and forth shell routine, but that ain't going to work for this. All right, that's all we need. I'm gonna rinse a little bit of this albumin off of my hand and get some ice. All right, now this one might make sense to dry shake or to mix the egg first, and certainly if you're using sugar, like in a traditional flip, you usually mix the egg and sugar together first. But IBA just calls for shaking it all over ice, so that's what we shall do. So in with some ice. Let's give it a shake. You do want to shake that pretty thoroughly to combine the yolk. And then you strain that into a small, ideally chilled, either wine glass or Nick and Nora, but a small one. And then for garnish, we need a bit of fresh nutmeg. And that is an IBA spec Porto Flip. So the nose, I'm getting a lot of the nutmeg, a little bit of barrely notes, probably mostly the cognac rather than the port. It's fine. It's cognac-y. The port is sort of adding tang. It's like tangy cognac. It's not that thick because of the method of creation. Obviously, egg should thicken this quite a bit, but we don't have the white, and we combined it cold. It just doesn't let it froth up nearly as much as I would like for it to. I just want to try this port on its own real quick just to pick out what flavors I'm getting from where. Yeah, so it's sweet, it's fruity. It's not a real heavy or syrupy sort of port. It's a little bit crisper. There's a little bit of age on it, a little bit of sort of a oxidized note, not in a spoiled way, but in a just aging oxidization way. Yeah, I get red fruits, I get a hint of citrus. It's nice. The problem is I think it's nicer on its own than with cognac and egg. Yeah, to me this drink just can't really choose a lane. It's not dry, nor is it sweet. It's just funky cognac. Yeah, so we may revisit some flips and maybe some more historical flips in a future wintertime episode, but this is what we have on the Porto Flip official IBA cocktail. Well, thanks for coming along with me today on this beer stroke Porto Flip journey. If you enjoyed the video or at least got through it okay, I'd appreciate a like, share, subscribe, comment, and all of those other YouTube type things. Visit the blog at shakingandsipping.com where we have a write-up on this and each other drink we cover. And most weeks, though probably not this one, the day following the video, we'll have a write-up on IBA in the real world, where we order this drink at a local cocktail bar to see what they do with it. You can follow on Twitter at shaking_sipping. And we'll be back next week with the next drink on the IBA Classic Cocktail List. That one being a drink I certainly like more than this one, though boy is it a pain to prepare, which may give you a hint as to what it is. Until next week, happy sipping. Cheers.